Hello, I am Elizabeth Hagedorn, diplomatic correspondent at Al Monitor. It's a pleasure to welcome you to what promises to be a timely and engaging conversation following Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's meeting yesterday with President Donald Trump. Both men are under pressure at home. Netanyahu faces a tough re-election battle, while Trump contends with an unpopular war that has driven up gasoline prices ahead of November's midterms. Disagreements over the Iran war, Turkey's regional ambitions, and more recently, Saudi Arabia's nuclear agreement with the United States are exposing deeper fault lines in the relationship. Over the next hour, we'll explore where Washington and Jerusalem converge, where they differ, and what it means for the region going forward. I'm pleased to introduce our distinguished panel. Joining us today is Ben Caspit, one of Israel's leading political commentators and an Al Monitor columnist. Also with us is Gönül, a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, where she focuses on Turkish politics, U.S.-Turkey relations, and regional dynamics in the Middle East. And finally, Dan Shapiro. He was U.S. Ambassador to Israel for much of the Obama administration, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East in the Biden administration, and currently a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council. I'll begin with questions for the panelists, and we'll save about 15 minutes at the end for your questions. You can submit those in the Q&A feature on your Zoom screen. Okay, so let's start with Netanyahu's visit to Washington. It was his first since the Iran war began in late February. Netanyahu came away from the meeting saying his meeting with Trump was among their best. Ben, I'll go to you first. What really happened behind closed doors? Was the meeting as positive as Netanyahu made it seem?
As expected, following Iran's surprise attack at night, Trump already gave an interview, I guess, to Fox, in which he said that the United States was going to hit Iran extremely hard. From Netanyahu's perspective, that is an encouraging sign, but it is still far too early to determine whether Trump has made a strategic decision or whether this is merely another limited round of retaliation of the kind we've seen before. Netanyahu just gave a briefing to the Israeli entourage, the journalists that escorted him. They did not escort him, actually. They come in a different way. It is worth recalling that only last weekend, Israel believed that the United States was on the verge of launching a strategic strike against Iran, only for the operation to be called off at the last moment. The real question, therefore, is whether this is simply a continuation of the exchange of fire, perhaps with a limited escalation, or whether the president has made a strategic decision to go all out. Ultimately, what matters is what the Americans choose to strike. In Israel, the prevailing view is that the campaign should focus on Iran's nuclear program in general, not on the stockpile, on the stockpile of enriched uranium in particular. That, after all, was the reason for going to war, not the Strait of Hormuz. I assume that the president sees it differently. Now, according to the reports from the prime minister's briefing, Netanyahu repeatedly stressed that he did not tell the president what he believed should be done, nor did he make any specific demand. Instead, the two discussed three possible scenarios: maintaining the current situation, returning to full-scale fighting, or pursuing an agreement. Netanyahu's role, he said, was to simply lay out the advantages and disadvantages of each option for the president. Now, either way, Netanyahu is stressed in the briefing that he gave moments ago that Israel did not ask the Americans to attack. This was the president's decision. The message was clearly intended for everyone in the room, including Vice President Vance and advisor Steve Witkoff, to make sure they understood that Netanyahu was not once again dragging the president into another military advantage, because in certain circles in Washington, maybe in all the circles, this is the actual assumption, that Netanyahu dragged Trump to the adventure. Now he's trying to go in this minefield to try and persuade the president, but not seem as the guy that is persuading the president. This is not easy.
Let me unmute myself there. So he's trying to persuade, without being so obvious, that the job is unfinished. I'm curious, Ben, because you've written quite a bit about this, how is Israel's security establishment, as opposed to Netanyahu, viewing a potential another round of conflict with Iran?
If you ask the army, the chief of staff, the best scenario is pursuing the current situation, a blockade, a siege, sanctions. The regime will not survive for long. You can never know when regime falls. History taught us that no one was able to say, listen, the Soviet Union is about to collapse, or the Arab Spring, etc. But the situation in Iran, according to intelligence, is grief. There is a very hot winter, no water, no electricity, no money. Prices are top all time. So the current situation, I think if you ask the establishment, the security establishment, if we need to go to a third round, they will say no. By the way, previous Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant was interviewed in Meet the Press a few days ago by myself and my colleague Amit Segal, and he said that there was a ground operation ready to be launched in the first round. I'm talking about June 25, a ground operation by Israeli elite forces and American elite forces to get out the enriched uranium from Iran. It was not done. I think the president he hesitated and decided he does not want boots on the ground. I don't blame him, but now it's impossible. If it's impossible, so there is no real need to go and strike again places that we already struck. Maybe only the three sites that this uranium is piles are there, and try to put it in a deeper grave. But no one in Israel but Netanyahu wants now a third round. We are after 3 years of war. Netanyahu, on the other side, needs a third round. He does not have a campaign. The total victory promised is not there, not in Gaza, not in Lebanon, not in Syria, and not in Iran. So his real problem is synchronization between the schedules, because Netanyahu's elections are in October. Trump's elections are in November. Trump cannot do it without paying political price before November. After October, it's irrelevant for Netanyahu. So this is a very, very striking and interesting situation. And after saying all that, as I said before, he's trying not to look like the guy that is dragging again the president in his hair to another adventure in Iran.
Dan, I want to go to you next. There was seemingly no daylight between Netanyahu and Trump at the beginning of this war, but we've increasingly seen Trump publicly voice his frustrations with Netanyahu, including in a Fox News interview just hours before their meeting yesterday. How do you assess where the relationship stands now?
Well, the relationship is functional. Obviously, these are two leaders who know each other well, work together. The meeting yesterday was that doesn't mean there's any the minds at the moment on this strategic. I think Ben described the dilemma, fundamental dilemma, but it's a dilemma of President Trump's own, right? So Prime Minister was an advocate for going to war, as he has been with Iran for many years and through many presidencies. February, he and they're decided on this. I won't hold the president to it. It was the president's decision, and he has ownership. But certainly the president advocated for it. This was shortly after the decapitation of the Venezuela government of Maduro, and the president had an outsized, but could within a few days the Iranian regime would collapse, just as Venezuela. The United States would be able to impose its will, and that was a terrible. And we got to a war, or we went into a war, which after 10 days or so of very effective military campaigning against nuclear sites and the Iranian leadership, of course, and certain other facilities, once Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz, all of the swung over Iran's direction. And that's been essentially what we've been fighting over ever since. We're now 5 months into this war, mostly about getting the Strait of Hormuz open. President Trump faces a fundamental dilemma making. Either get the Strait of Hormuz open, which is doable through some sort of agreement, even though with that, Iran will retain some sort of control, drive some sort of revenue fees, escalations. I think that's sort of not unlikely as the new normal forward. But that's the one area. He needs to do that to get the price of oil down and get gas prices felt before the mid pressure off his party into those mid. The other option that he is considering, and he has said it openly, and obviously the one that I was advocating, said is resumed and destroy nuclear, maybe pickaxe others, perhaps energy targets, and even the Iranian economic crisis, and because if we're to resume major military operations, Iran's going to respond. They already respond and poke. We saw this. It's have no tools in their quiver, which they have. Really unleashing the Houthis in the Red Sea. Their strikes on Gulf targets, things that will shock that we've already experienced just the war back. So to decide between these two totally incompatible pathways, he's got Netanyahu urging one, political interest going in the other direction, and so that interest, I think, is what characterizes the moment.
Dan, I think we're having a little bit of an audio issue with you. I'm going to have Audrey reach out and see if we can get that sorted. Meanwhile, Gönül, Dan just spoke about...
Without the AirPods. Sorry.
Perfect. We've got it sorted. Okay. Dan just spoke about Netanyahu's relationship with Trump, how that has experienced some friction over Iran. But by contrast, Turkish President Erdogan still seems to have Trump's ear. The rapport was evident at the NATO summit in Ankara earlier this month. How would you characterize Erdogan's influence with the White House right now?
Well, thank you, Liz. I think what really sets the Trump-Erdogan relationship apart is how deeply personal the relationship is. Unlike previous US presidents, Trump has never placed much emphasis on democracy or human rights in dealing with Turkey, and that has made him a much easier partner for President Erdogan. Certainly, the two leaders have remarkably similar instincts. They both prefer direct leader-to-leader diplomacy and tend to see institutions and bureaucracies as obstacles rather than assets. And Erdogan has been very good at recognizing that and framing issues in ways that appeal to President Trump. I mean, he presents himself as someone who can deliver on Syria, NATO, or broader regional security. And of course, Turkey's strategic importance gives Erdogan real leverage as well. And then I think there's also the business angle. Trump's financial ties to Turkey, I mean, particularly through the Trump Towers, those issues also have raised legitimate conflict of interest questions. But I should also add that the Trump-Erdogan relationship hasn't always been this warm. During Trump's first term, he sent Erdogan that extraordinary letter threatening to destroy Turkey's economy if Ankara didn't stop its offensive in northern Syria. And he famously told him, don't be a tough guy, don't be a fool. And it was deeply embarrassing for President Erdogan. And the Trump administration also imposed CAATSA sanctions on Turkey's defense industry over its purchase of the Russian S-400 missile systems. So I think that's the downside of highly personalized relationships. I mean, they can produce quick wins when things are going well, but they can also unravel very quickly when the relationship sours. So when foreign policy depends, I mean, too much on personal chemistry, it's inherently unpredictable. But right now, the relationship between the two leaders is very close.
Gönül, to tie this back into some of what Ben and Dan were saying on the Netanyahu visit, I imagine Erdogan was watching closely. Could he take advantage of these strains in the U.S.-Israel relationship to advance Turkey's own interests, perhaps on issues like the F-35s or on Syria? How do you see that?
Well, he would certainly welcome any daylight between U.S. and Israel, because I mean, from Syria and Lebanon to the Horn of Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean, um, Israel's policies are increasingly colliding with Erdogan's regional agenda. In almost every arena where Turkey is trying to expand its influence or shape the regional order, it now finds itself bumping up against Israeli interests. So from Ankara's perspective, Trump's blank check for Netanyahu has only made Israel more assertive across the region. And Turkish officials believe that as long as Netanyahu knows he has Trump's backing, he's more likely to pursue policies that run directly against Turkey's interests. I remember that shortly after the June war with Iran began, I asked a senior Turkish official whether people in Ankara still believed the Erdogan-Trump relationship was this magic wand that could solve Turkey's problems with the United States. And he said, you know, the chemistry between the two leaders is real and it's very useful. But when push comes to shove, it's Netanyahu who has Trump's ear. And I think that really captures how Turkish officials see the relationship. I mean, they value this personal relationship with Trump, but they also recognize its limits, especially when Turkey's interests clash with Israel's. But certainly, that the strain in U.S.-Israeli ties is something very useful, because Turkey pursues interests, I mean, in Lebanon, in Syria, and it sees Israeli actions as steps undermining what Turkey is trying to do. So the prospects of Trump curbing Israeli actions in the region in these theaters is something that's considered very useful.
Earlier this month, Netanyahu called Turkey a regime infected by the Muslim Brotherhood that, quote, hates America. Dan, does Israel see stronger Turkey-U.S. ties as a threat to its own standing with this White House?
I think so. I think it also sees Turkey as a rising regional rival. There's been some discussion in the Israeli security establishment, Ben could speak to this, that if and when the Iranian regime falls, and perhaps the Iranian axis of resistance, which has been weakened so much over the last 3 years, although it's down but not out, but if it's really kind of put out of business or really severely weakened, that actually the next regional rival that Israel might face is Turkey, or a Turkish-led bloc, perhaps to include the Ashara regime in Syria and other Sunni actors that have an ideological fixation on Israel. I think that's an exaggeration and it's an overstatement of the situation, but that discourse does exist. I think the more immediate concerns that you hear from Israelis are, will the United States essentially give a green light to, and has it maybe already, a kind of Turkish domination, or at least an overriding influence in Damascus. Of course, Ambassador Barrack's role as both the ambassador to Turkey and kind of the special envoy managing the Syria transition seems to play toward that notion that the United States is fine with a very, very heavy Turkish hand and influence by in Syria, and Israel has concerns about that, limitations they would like to put on the kinds of assistance Turkey provides Syria, where Turkish forces might be placed in Syria, whether they be anywhere south of Damascus, for example. So those kinds of issues. And then this F-35 deal that has been proposed that President Trump is advocating for. That's going to have to go through a congressional review even before it can do that. Turkey will have to divest of its S-400 air defense systems from Russia. That's in U.S. law. But assuming it will, and there's been rumors, of course, about it selling those secondhand to the UAE or some other actor, so it would clear the decks to acquire the F-35. And assuming that Congress is willing to go along with this sale, which I don't know that we can assume, but that's going to raise for Israel what they call qualitative military edge concerns, the QME, the standard that is in U.S. law and longstanding U.S. policy to ensure Israel has an edge. Now, of course, Israel has nearly 50 F-35s in its own Air Force. It's on the way to acquiring almost double that number. And so, by the time the first Turkish F-35, if it ever comes, would land in Turkey, Israel would have more than a decade of experience using dozens and dozens of F-35s in highly active combat situations. So I'm not sure we can say that, if Turkey has a small number of F-35s, that's really a qualitative threat or a threat to Israel's qualitative military edge. But Israel will almost certainly seek some kind of compensation for that, whether it's its own systems, whether some defensive measures, whether it's limitations on how Turkey could use those F-35s as part of the conditions of selling that deal. And that's complicated by Israel's declining political standing in the United States. We see it in votes in Congress, where half the Democrats just voted to cut off all military assistance. We see it in some of Vice President Vance's statements about his concern about Israeli interests clashing with U.S. interests. The general decline, it's visible in all polls of Israel's standing, and the notion of the United States being a major supplier of the Israeli military among Democrats and Republicans complicates Israel's ability to do what it's done in the past, which is mitigate arms sales to regional rivals that it's concerned about with compensatory ways of maintaining its qualitative military edge.
Ben, a similar question to you. I know you've covered this dynamic closely for Al Monitor. How worried is Netanyahu that Turkey is positioning itself as a more useful regional partner for Trump than Israel in some contexts?
First of all, it's very interesting to hear my colleague from Turkey says that when push comes to shove, Netanyahu will have the President Trump's ear, because from Tel Aviv, where I see it, it looks totally different. And we can just listen to the president when he was saying the other day that no one will tell me if I can sell or not sell F-35s. It was a hint to Netanyahu. First of all, maybe 10 minutes was talking about Netanyahu is a good guy and he succeeded in Syria, only in Syria. And then it was talking maybe 30 seconds about Erdogan, how an excellent ally he is. And this is the feeling right now in Jerusalem, that Erdogan is winning the war on the heart of Trump. And I'll dive into the details of the F-35 deal. The question of supplying F-35 stealth fighters to Turkey in many ways is a replay of earlier controversy over a possible sale to the UAE. The issue surfaced several years ago and has since receded from the agenda. I don't know if you remember, but at that time, even though the UAE is a close Israeli ally, unlike Turkey, Defense Minister Benny Gantz immediately flew to Washington to address the matter with the US administration. From Israel's professional defense perspective, the central question is not simply whether another country receives F-35s, but which version it receives and what capabilities that version possesses. Israel works to ensure that the aircraft supplied to it and subsequently upgraded with American approval remain the most advanced variant, preserving Israel's qualitative military edge in the Middle East, like the Ambassador Shapiro just said. The F-35 is not merely an aircraft. Judged solely as a conventional fighter jet, its performance is arguably mediocre. Its real strength is that it functions as an extraordinary airborne intelligence command and control platform capable of monitoring and managing a vast theater of operations. A pilot flying an F-35 does not require a separate airborne command unit, the aircraft itself can manage the entire sector and significantly enhance the effectiveness of other friendly aircraft, including aircraft that are not F-35. And as for Turkey, Israel and Turkey are now only a short distance from openly defining one another as enemy states. We are not there quite yet, but anyone who listens to President Erdogan and his foreign minister Hakan Fidan and Netanyahu understands the direction of travel. Israel sees Turkey as an explicit threat, both through Syria and through the possibility of a radical Sunni axis that Ankara may seek to mobilize against it. For Israel, therefore, the delivery of F-35 to Turkey would constitute a direct blow to its national security. And after having said all that, Netanyahu knows that if Trump decides to sell the aircraft to Turkey, he will do so. As things stand, Erdogan is closer to Netanyahu, as I said before, closer to Trump than Netanyahu is right now. And this is why Israel is relatively keeping low profile on this possible issue. And I can only say this much. If Trump resolves the Iranian nuclear problem, I guess Netanyahu would probably be willing to personally fly an F-35 to Ankara and give Erdogan the handover briefing himself. But we're not there yet.
Gönül, I'd like to bring you in on this. Trump has been dismissive of Netanyahu's concerns about Washington potentially selling the fighter jets to Turkey. He told reporters this week that Turkey has been a tremendous ally and that, quote, nobody tells me what we should be selling. Why does Trump seem so eager for this, to make this sale happen for Turkey, even over Netanyahu's objections? Can you talk a bit about that?
Well, I think first we really have to focus on, there are two separate issues. One is the US allowing Turkey to receive the 6 F-35s that Turkey has already paid for. That's number one issue. And the number two is Turkey getting back into the F-35 program as a production partner. Now, as for the second, I don't think that's possible. Things already have moved on, and I don't think Turkey can get back into the F-35 program as a production partner, although Ambassador Tom Barak says that it is possible and it's imminent, but I don't think so. Now, regarding the first, Turkey getting the F-35s that were built for Turkey, that's not a done deal either, despite the pledge from President Trump. Remember, during the NATO summit in Ankara, on the first day, Trump sounded really upbeat. He said that he really wants Turkey to receive the F-35s, but in his later remarks, he sounded less upbeat about that. And there is that. And the second thing is, it's really, there's a piece of US legislation in place. You have, and I'm not talking about CATSA, but there's the NDAA. And the NDAA language is very clear. It says that for Turkey to receive those F-35s, it needs to get rid of the S-400s. And it's not just Turkey making it non-operational, but it cannot stay on Turkish soil. So that can only happen if Turkey transfers the S-400s to a third country. Now, that is possible. That is something Erdogan desperately wants. I think it was 6 or 7 months ago when Erdogan held this phone conversation with President Putin. And he raised the issue, saying that Turkey would like Russia to take it back. And now there have been discussions between Turkey and Russia about Turkey sending the S-400s to a third country. And reportedly, Putin is open to the idea. But I think it's not really clear-cut. It's not a straightforward process. And by the way, the State Department recently wrote a letter to members of Congress saying that US law is clear. If Turkey doesn't solve the S-400 problem, it cannot receive the F-35s. And similarly, J.D. Vance made it clear. He referred to the US law, the text of the NDAA. So that means the ball is in Turkey's court right now. So it all comes down to what Turkey can do with the S-400s. And that brings me to the UAE question. Now, there's been these reports talking about Turkey is in talks with the Emiratis. The Emiratis might be interested in receiving the S-400s. To me, that does not make any sense. And there are several reasons. One, Israelis and Emiratis are close partners, and it's not a secret that Israel does not like the idea of Turkey getting F-35. So that's number one. Number two, any country that is interested in cultivating close defense ties with the United States, like the United Arab Emirates, wouldn't want the S-400s, right? Because it will have the same problem. We know that the Emiratis expressed interest in receiving, in purchasing the F-35s. So imagine a scenario where they have the S-400s, they will have the same problem as Turkey. And finally, the third problem with that arrangement is that any arrangement is subject to Russian approval. Russia has to green light any deal. And I don't see why Putin will help President Erdogan solve the S-400 problem. That S-400 problem was a big advantage for President Putin. He managed to drive a wedge between Turkey and the US, Turkey and NATO. So it's been very useful. And I don't see why in this particular moment where Turkish-Russian relationship has changed in favor of Erdogan, why he would want to help Erdogan here.
Okay, let's switch gears a little bit. And before we do, I just want to remind our virtual audience that you can submit questions using the Q&A feature. I see a few coming in. We'll be sure to get to those. But first, last week, the Trump administration announced a civil nuclear deal with Saudi Arabia that would allow U.S. nuclear technology to be exported to the kingdom, prompting Israeli concerns that it could trigger a regional arms race. Ben, was Israel caught off guard by this deal? And what exactly about the prospect of a civilian nuclear program in Saudi Arabia worries Israeli officials most?
It was not quite a surprise. It's a little, okay, the proposed civilian nuclear program that the United States is expected to provide Saudi Arabia raises several serious concerns. First, Israel still does not know exactly what has been agreed upon. The deal has been signed, but it contains no reference to normalization with Israel. And the day after it was signed, suddenly the president appeared and said it will not be signed or approved without normalization. Then Israeli officials also understand that the deal permits uranium enrichment on Saudi soil, unlike the arrangement granted to the United Arab Emirates, which did not include the domestic enrichment. Under those circumstances, Israel should be expected to oppose this agreement. The previous Israeli government, by the way, led by Bennett and Lapid, firmly opposed a Saudi civilian nuclear program, even in exchange for normalization. Netanyahu, by contrast, gave the idea a hesitant and partial endorsement, but he did not intend for uranium enrichment to take place inside Saudi Arabia. There is a broad consensus among Israeli professionals within the security establishment, and in my view, across much of the political system, that domestic enrichment in Saudi Arabia is a red line. According to virtually every expert, uranium enrichment is effectively a training ground for a nuclear weapons capability. A country that enriches uranium by its own, even to low levels, and under the framework of a civilian program, is acquiring the knowledge, the know-how, infrastructure, and experience that could later enable it to build a bomb. Israel also fears that enrichment in Saudi Arabia would lead Egypt, Turkey, other regional powers to demand the same. It will be a race, enriched uranium, civil enriched uranium race in the Middle East. And above all, it would create a fundamental contradiction. On what grounds could the United States and the rest of the free world continue demanding that Iran refrain from enriching uranium on its own soil, while allowing its principal Sunni rival, Saudi Arabia, to do exactly that? But still, I don't see Netanyahu doing something because, as we said before, I look at Ambassador Shapiro and I recall the days when the Obama administration suddenly learned that Netanyahu is going to appear in Congress and have that speech without coordinating it with the president, etc. And what they did, the revenge was one decision in the Security Council that was not vetoed. In the Trump era, he can do anything. Netanyahu knows it. No checks, no balances. Israel is like all the other states. So this is the reason you don't hear what I just said aloud.
Dan, Israel is clearly concerned by the possibility of future Saudi enrichment. How might those concerns change, or would this deal become more acceptable to Israel were this condition added by President Trump to somehow become a formal part of this deal if Saudi Arabia, were to take some steps towards normalization, or at least a nod towards normalization?
Yeah, to Ben's point, it's hard to imagine the prime minister going to Congress today to speak against President Trump's policies on regional security matters as he did in 2015. So just a little history on this, which is that during the Biden administration, which I served at the Pentagon, we were in fact, even after October 7th, well into the war. It started before, but it continued even during the war. In negotiations with Saudi Arabia about an overall package of agreements. One of them would have been Saudi normalization with Israel. Israel would have had to make commitments regarding the credible pathway, let's call it, to a Palestinian state. Hard to imagine this Israeli government doing that. Maybe it would have required some change there, but that was part of the package. Certainly the Saudis insisted on it. The United States and Saudi Arabia would sign a mutual security treaty, would require Senate ratification, both sides making commitments to each other regarding security questions. And a civil nuclear agreement was also part of this package. I wasn't directly involved in its negotiation, but I'm largely aware of its dimensions. And as I understand, it did include the possibility, following some consultations and some study and so forth, of some enrichment on Saudi soil, but under very strict U.S. supervision, maybe even entire U.S. control, and various other safeguards and inspections to make sure that it could only be used for civilian needs. And none of this was hidden from Israel. All of this was presented as a package, and there was consultation. Israel was well aware of what the elements of this package were. And, nobody ever had to make a final decision because we never got to the end. We didn't get the ceasefire. We didn't get the hostage deal. We didn't have to reach that moment of decision. But my strong impression at the time was that the prime minister would not have objected to that civil nuclear deal, which included that U.S. supervised enrichment possibility, if it also included Saudi normalization. Of course, he'd have to make his own very tough commitments on the Palestinian issue. So the package made sense in that regard. It even then raised some of the very issues that Ben described about what are the implications of a Saudi domestic enrichment capability, even under U.S. supervision. Does that mean the UAE, which forswore that possibility as part of what's called the gold standard civil nuclear agreement with the United States, would they claim they also then have the right to gain enrichment on their soil? Would Egypt, Turkey, and other countries also try to gain that capability? I don't know if the exact version that the Biden administration was working out is mirrored in the Trump administration signed. It hasn't been released, of course. There are rumors or suggestions that maybe the safeguards are not quite as strict, or there's less clear U.S. supervision. But again, that's somewhat speculative. But even those questions, I think, would have been raised under those circumstances. But again, in the context of the big strategic shift of Saudi normalization with Israel, presumably many other Arab and Muslim countries joining that, Israel's more inclusive welcoming into the region as a full player, also in the context of some direction toward resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, maybe it's a little easier to imagine that type of agreement going down a little bit easier. What's puzzling about the whole situation we're in, first of all, is that the Trump administration seemed to make this agreement without the same kind of consultation with Israel as the Biden administration did. It clearly divorced it from the normalization question, the major incentive that might have made it possible for Israel to accept. And then, as soon as it was criticized, within 12 hours or so, the president put out a social media post where he was saying, well, it doesn't really go into effect unless Saudi normalizes with Israel, but that's not in the agreement. And the Saudi response to that was, tweets don't override signed agreements. That's, of course, how most countries do diplomacy. They look at the text of agreements, and that's what they go by. I think it's done some damage to U.S. credibility, on top of a lot of other things that do damage to U.S. credibility, as whether our negotiators are empowered, whether they mean what they say. I think the MOU with Iran has had some of the same effect. This is a feature of diplomacy in the Trump era, that his moods, his whims, who he talks to last, and the fact that it's all personal. Whatever comes down from him overrides whatever the system and the different agencies in the government have produced. So I think there's a lot of confusion about where this goes. At the moment, it sounds as though the agreement's on the shelf, not going to be submitted to Congress. But over time, if Trump changes his mind, he may decide, yeah, you know what, I'd like to get the commercial benefit of those Saudi deals to buy U.S. Nuclear reactors. Perhaps there are even people in the Trump family or Trump circle who are going to benefit financially from this. We can't rule that out, the way business is conducted these days. And he may decide to pursue it, or at least submit it to Congress for review, even though his belated addition of the normalization condition hasn't been established.
Gönül, if this deal with Saudi Arabia moves ahead, how might Turkey interpret that in terms of its regional status? Could it perhaps embolden Turkey to pursue its own enrichment?
I think Turkey is already recalibrating its position on nuclear weapons. When Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan was asked directly about the issue by a journalist, he didn't rule it out, and he didn't endorse it either. He gave a notably vague answer, which to me suggests that Ankara really wants to keep its options open as the regional security environment becomes more uncertain. Now, Turkey is one of the two countries in the region that have signed the so-called 123 agreements with the United States, nuclear cooperation agreements. Turkey is building, like Egypt, large nuclear plants. And when US officials pressed Turkey not to produce fuel, they rejected that. So I think, from what I see from all that, the statements from Turkish officials is that if Iran crosses the nuclear threshold, and like Saudi officials, I think Turkish officials are somewhat signaling that if Iran crosses the nuclear threshold, they would likely follow. And this deal only makes it more likely. And I have little doubt that Erdogan would like to see Turkey join the nuclear club as part of his legacy. But it's not very straightforward. I mean, as NPT signatories, both Turkey and Saudi Arabia, they have to factor in how allies and rivals would respond. So I think rather than outright weaponization, a more plausible path for Turkey is pursuing greater technical autonomy while formally staying within NPT commitments.
Okay, I think we're going to transition now to some audience questions, and we have quite a few about the election in October. So I guess I'll go to both Ben and Dan with this question. Just simply, what is your prediction? Can Netanyahu hold on to power? There's been some recent polling that put Eisenkot's party ahead of Likud. Tell me what your expectations are.
Can I have an easier one? We call this the most important and historic elections in the history of Israel, because it will decide the path the only Jewish state on earth is going to, staying the Jewish democratic liberal state that was established by the ancestors, or going to a different way that I don't want even to imagine. Right now, the chances of Netanyahu to be able to form a government are very, very slim. His coalition that holds 68 mandates in the Knesset after Gideon Sa'ar joined him gains in polls between 50 and 52 mandates. You need 61. But you never write off Netanyahu. This is the ultimate comeback kid. His problem is that he does not have any agenda or a campaign. We were talking about it before. This is the reason that he needs something to show the Israeli public, especially in security, especially in Iran, because in Gaza he's losing, and no one sees any breakthrough, serious breakthrough in the other fronts. And he needs a miracle, but this guy got some miracles in history, so you will never write him off. On the other hand, Eisenkot is not seen to be able to win 61 mandates and up. The question is, what will happen if the results will be something like 59, 51? All the other mandates are Arab Knesset members. And I think, and Gadi Eisenkot said it, that he will swear a government. You can call it a minority government without the support of the Arab parties, without any agreement with the Arab parties. This is a thing that many in Israel object, but he will say, I have a Zionist majority, 59, Bibi has only 51, I am forming a government. This is, if I have to gamble right now, this is what's going to happen, without thinking about things that we cannot imagine that can happen in these 3 months. And in Israel and the Middle East, you will always expect something to happen. And as they say in the Israeli Air Force, the one that will kill you on air is the one that you don't see right now.
Dan, I'll pose the same question to you. How do you see the elections in October playing out?
Well, I think that's what all the polls show, and that does mean that Netanyahu could, if they hold in that basic framework, Netanyahu could not form a government. Eisenkot might be able to form a minority government, might be able to take in an Arab party like Mansour Abbas's Ram party, as the previous Bennett-Lapid government did, to get to a majority. If none of those work, of course, that means Netanyahu can remain in a caretaker status while Israel runs another election, and he'll have by himself 6 more months. That's probably his best chance for survival. Of course, Israelis are going to have to make this decision. And, one of the things that is new in the political discourse there, although I don't think, and Ben probably could confirm this, it has yet penetrated, perhaps as much as it may yet, is the decline in Israel's standing in the United States. I mentioned it earlier. Every poll shows a dramatic decline in favorable views about Israel, certainly about the Israeli government, among Democrats and Republicans. It's a little stronger on the Democratic side, but it's coming up quickly on the Republican side. It's very strong among younger voters in both parties. And that is going to affect whether the United States will continue to be willing to provide military assistance as it has historically to Israel. But currently, there are negotiations on a follow-on MOU of the 10-year agreement that we negotiated at the end of the Biden administration. It's not at all clear that there would be political support by any administration or by Congress under any party's leadership to continue that kind of relationship with Israel. Lots of criticism, of course, of how the war was conducted in Gaza, including the far too many civilian casualties, criticism of this Iran war, historic objections to Netanyahu's involvement in American politics, like the speech in Congress in 2015. So these are questions that it will be interesting to see if they emerge into the Israeli political discussion. But how Netanyahu has conducted Israel's affairs and how he's conducted the relationship with the United States, whether that's becoming a national security threat in some ways to Israel and whether that moves any votes. There aren't a lot of swing voters in Israeli elections. I think Ben would confirm this. If there are any, it's probably 2 to 3 seats worth, maybe that's 150,000 people, of soft Likud voters. They're basically security hawks. They've always voted for Netanyahu, but they're upset with him over October 7th. They're upset with him over corruption. They're upset with him over the ultra-Orthodox draft exemption that he's trying to push through. And maybe if those people look at Gadi Eisenkot, a career military officer coming out of that background into politics, perhaps reluctantly, and now a bereaved father because his son was killed in Gaza, that if they see him as someone who can keep Israel safe and maybe have a less contentious relationship with the U.S. public and therefore with the U.S. politics, that might be better for Israel's national security. We'll see if that idea penetrates into that relatively small number of swing voters that might be able to create a majority for the opposition bloc.
If I may add in this point, the fact that Netanyahu is coming back from Washington without a hug from the president, one of Netanyahu's greatest assets politically was what they say in Hebrew, he's from a different league. He is an international leader. He can talk to Trump and Putin and everyone. Now, he came to the White House through the back door, no photo op, no press conference. He said, we exchange views, him and the president. So he lost this asset before the election, and this is a bad sign for him. And about what just Ambassador Shapiro said, 100%, the loss of America for Israel is a historical, biblical disaster. Many Israelis think alike. The problem is that the swing voters are not there. It's not 2 or 3 mandates then. I think it's between 6 and 10 mandates. The soft Likudniks, the soft religious Zionists, and they see other issues. They don't feel or live right now this disaster. And it's a disaster because from the state of the security of Israel, the national security, the treaty with the United States is more important than what they say we have down in Dimona. And if we are losing it, and we are, this thing has to be fixed as soon as possible. And the only one that cannot fix it is Netanyahu.
Yeah, and Ben, I would just add to that. I believe Trump a few weeks ago was asked whether he would endorse Netanyahu in October, and he said something to the effect of probably, but I need to see who's running first. So to your point, he didn't get the photo op or the endorsement he maybe came here looking for. Gönül, we have a related question here from one of our audience members. They're asking, or they're saying that Turkish officials have signaled relations could improve in the post-Netanyahu era. Could a change in government in Israel lead to positive outcomes for the bilateral relationship?
I think it's entirely plausible that we'll see a reset in Turkish-Israeli relations, especially in a post-Netanyahu era. One thing we've learned over the years is never to underestimate Erdogan's pragmatism. He once called Egypt's Sisi a dictator and insisted he would never normalize relations with him. He accused the United Arab Emirates of backing the 2016 coup attempt against his government. And today, Turkey has not only restored ties with these countries, but has very close defense ties, which requires a lot of the faith in each other. So I think if the strategic incentives change, Erdogan has shown that he's willing to make dramatic course corrections.
We just have a few more minutes, and I just wanted to give each of you the floor to share any closing thoughts about this dynamic between Netanyahu and Trump, how Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey factor in, and what you see in the months ahead. Ben, maybe we'll start with you.
To push this button. First of all, it's a close call, and it's too early to know exactly what happened in the room between Trump and Netanyahu. It was only 1 hour and 20 minutes for between 4 and 5 core issues. It's not only Iran, it's Gaza, it's Hezbollah, it's Lebanon, and everything else. So it's too early, but all the signs show, like you said, Elizabeth, that the hug from the president is not there. I have to mention that a very influential Israeli woman, Miriam Edelson, the widow of the late Sheldon Edelson, is not a Netanyahu supporter anymore, and she's very close to the president. By the way, she's very close to Naftali Bennett, but I know that lately even Gadi Eisenkot met her, and I think her word in the president's ear is essential. The crucial question from Netanyahu is leave all these signs alone and hugs. Will the president give me something before the election? And something is an achievement in Iran. I'm not sure it will not happen. We have to wait. And one final word, 24 hours after the meeting, we haven't heard a word from the president yet about the pardon to Netanyahu. So if nothing will be said, maybe he left this idea or deserted this idea. And if so, the main winner of this meeting is not the prime minister, neither President Trump, but President Herzog.
Dan, any closing thoughts?
I think we really are viewing the beginning of a different American set of relationships and way of relating to the Middle East. And that's going to evolve, obviously, through the remainder of the Trump administration, but it will go on into the future as well. And so exactly what shape it will take, we don't know. But I've mentioned the decline in Israel's standing in the United States politics, which isn't, by the way, going to change without, or can't be reversed anyway, without a change of leadership in Israel. That's clear. I mean, Netanyahu is so associated with so many of the controversies of it. That doesn't mean if there is a change of leadership that automatically changes everything or fixes everything. It may be a necessary but not sufficient condition. But so the outcome of this Israeli election will be very, very influential on the direction of this relationship. But so will President Trump's desire to do security deals and commercial deals with those leaders in the region, like MBS, like Erdogan, who he feels a kinship with or feels an identification with. So will, of course, what happens on the ground in Gaza, whether the 20-point plan advances or continues to just sort of stall in place where it is now after the hostage deal and the ceasefire. And whether or not the Lebanon plan, the framework agreement that was signed, advances with more Israeli withdrawal as the Lebanese armed forces take over areas and try to disarm Hezbollah. So lots will shift and lots will change. And again, Israeli voters will probably, I don't know if they will, but they might want to take into account that's questions about Israel's standing and in terms of Israel's ability to influence those types of decisions that this administration and a future administration will make, and whether the U.S.-Israel relationship will still be sort of a pillar of U.S. Middle East partnership policy, or just one country among others that the United States has to figure out how to work with.
Gönül, you have the final word.
Well, one point I would make, and I know it's not a particularly popular view in Washington, is that I don't think Turkey and Israel are on the verge of a military clash. I mean, despite the increasingly fiery rhetoric from both Erdogan and Netanyahu, neither side has an interest in letting the rivalry escalate into direct conflict. That said, any widening of tensions between Trump and Netanyahu is something Ankara would certainly welcome. Because it creates more room for Turkey to advance its regional objectives.
Okay, unfortunately, I think that is all the time we have for today. I want to thank the team at Al Monitor for putting this webinar on, and our truly impressive panelists, Ben Caspit, Ambassador Dan Shapiro, and Gönül Toll. Thank you all for watching.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.